Speaker, I recognise that time is short, so I won't go on too long, and I won't take too many interventions. But you never know; you might get lucky. Can I say to my right honourable friend, I appreciate his excellent speech that he made just now, and whilst I wanted to agree with it all, I have to tell him that I didn't wholly agree with it, and I want to come to a couple of points. However, I don't doubt for one moment his sincere desire to make sure that this country is able to strike trade deals around the world and thus make the greatest advantage over the big decision that was taken back in 2016. The question for me is, are we going to be able to do that, and what does this agreement do to be able to help us, or does it? And there are really one point on that I would say, and I come back to the point that my honourable friend made earlier on, is that I do think that the issue of alignment is a very, very big and important issue here within this agreement. And I do think that we have conceded too much to the European Union, which hamstrings us in our future trade agreements. I think, in fact, my right honourable friend has actually said this in terms elsewhere. The US ambassador, as he knows, recently has made this point also clear. We may want to do financial services deals with other countries, but for many other countries, including America, they want to do more in agricultural and mechanical exports. And agriculture is a very big deal in the States, and they'd like to do that. And I do think there's been a rather supercilious and pointless debate about things like chlorinated chicken. We do tend to get a bit arrogant about the fact that somehow we are fantastically superior when, for example, well, let's just take the issue of this so-called chlorinated chicken. In America, they actually have a lower level of death and illness from Campylobacter or Salmonella than we do here in the UK. Why? Because some of our imports of chicken come from way outside the EU and are less than really that great. So I just simply say to people, let's not be so arrogant about the way that we think our standards survive and higher than everybody else. But I want to come to three very main points, and then I will conclude why I am really concerned. The first, of course, is the backstop. The right honourable gentleman who spoke just now has referred to it. We've all referred to it. My concern about the backstop is twofold. First of all, that the backstop itself does in fact trap us if we go into the backstop in a way that therefore takes the ability of us to leave away from our own hands. And it will be the first time that as a sovereign nation we will have agreed to let others decide whether we can stay or leave a particular international agreement. You know, we can leave NATO, we can leave the UN if we wish, we can even leave the EU at our vote. But on this we will not be able to leave. It has to be a joint agreement about departure, and there is no time limit to it. And so I was really interested to see what the Prime Minister would come back with in terms of this agreement. And I see that this letter from the joint President Tusk and President Juncker to her, but it doesn't, you know, it was said that it's very, very good and important because it is in fact internationally legally binding, but they know and we know that it isn't the same as being bound in terms of the agreement, and the agreement overrides every other purpose. And it was interesting that the previous Prime Minister, when he was negotiating prior to the referendum, claimed this as well at the time about his agreement, but again it did not override European law. And they actually say here, as you know, we are not in the position to agree to anything that changes or is inconsistent with the withdrawal agreement. Yeah. And even more important than that, I think, is really what the Attorney General has said about this. So there was a great moment here when the Prime Minister quite legitimately said that he spoke about the balance of this and said that this agreement, now they were accepting that there was some kind of lock in legal terms. But actually what she didn't do was read the last sentence of the paragraph. And there it says, albeit they do not alter the fundamental meaning of the provisions as I advised them back on the 13th of November. And that fundamental advice was very simply this. Therefore, despite statements in the protocol that it is not intended to be permanent, that the clear intention of the parties that it should be replaced by alternative permanent arrangements, in international law, the protocol would endure indefinitely until a superseding arrangement took place in whole or in part therein. And I simply say that that really does remind us that there is a fundamental flaw with this. And it's not because, actually, I fear us going into the backstop. My real problem is, when it comes to negotiating our future trade arrangements, they have a very big stick to hold over us. President Macron made that very clear quite recently when he talked about grabbing back some of the fishing rights that we may well have taken in the course of the early withdrawal agreement, because he said quite in terms, we will simply wait till they get closer and closer to the backstop, and as they get closer, they will do almost anything to avoid falling into it. And I don't disagree. It would be appalling if we ended up in the backstop. They know it, we know it, and that is the major problem. And I say that simply in line of my right honourable friend's earlier remarks, as I said, which I complimented, and I do think I have no doubt at all in his determination to drive these points. And it's no wonder, small wonder, that my right honourable friend, the member for Fulham, made it very clear the other day in a very interesting intervention that, having read carefully as he does in German all these various interviews, that Mr. Selmayr made it very clear that as far as the European Union is concerned from this withdrawal agreement, they got all their objectives happily sorted out, which means that we clearly didn't. And I think that is the major problem. So the first thing is on the backstop. It's not so much, I think, when it is important enough not to be in it, but I think the most important thing is not falling into it is what changes the pattern of the political agreement that we've set and how we negotiate those trade arrangements. And I think, therefore, with respect to my honourable friend, it is a major, major problem. The second part of it, I think, which is important, is that we have agreed the £39 billion. Now, I'm not against us agreeing to be paying the European Union to stand by further agreements, if such as they exist. After all, I do recall they said about £100 billion to begin with, and it got down to £39 billion, which does suggest to me there weren't quite so many absolutes in that set of things that we were supposed to be engaged in. But that notwithstanding, I don't want to be mealy-mouthed about it. £39 billion is a lot of money. Now, one section of that is, of course, the two-year interregnum, which would cost us money. I accept that. That's essentially the 10 or 11 billion, the 22 billion in total over the 2 years that we would owe them for that. That's part of the budget. The rest is about the future arrangements. And my concern here is that according to this arrangement, they will get that regardless of whether we actually reach any kind of satisfactory agreement. Now, I think that's quite an important feature. Back in December, I did say on record that I thought the government would be mistaken in agreeing both the backstop and the money without absolutely having any idea what that trade position would be. Now, the government said, don't worry, because we will come immediately to trade and it will open the door. Well, it didn't open the door, and we only just got to trade a few months before Christmas. And that's because when you've given them the most important negotiating position you have, that leaves you with very little to drive them into the next element, which is what we really want, which is trade. And I don't resile from the point we want to have a trade deal with our nearest trading partner. Of course we do. We don't want to end up in some kind of spitting war with them. We want to have a decent, reasonable arrangement. We also want to have other arrangements around the world. And I think, therefore, the problem we've got is right now, as it stands, this £39 billion is hinged on nothing at all other than they get it regardless. That's not much of an incentive for them to produce any sort of trade arrangement that we would want, and that's what worries me. And it worries, I think, members of the public. Sorry, indeed, my honourable friend.
No, thank you so much for making giveaways. Making a great point. Now, my honourable friend has a great deal of experience in a previous department of DWP, and I would put that this money is very important in order to keep our relationship going with Europe, to get the negotiations we want. And that whilst I won't say it's small fry, 39 billion, I did a calculation last night, is just 74 days of what we spend out in DWP. So in the grand scheme of things, it's not a huge amount of money for what we are getting out of it for the relationship that we need to build.
I'm grateful for that intervention from my honourable friend. I know it's well meant, but as someone who eventually resigned because we had to take a 12 billion cut from the welfare budget and we say we will spend 39 billion on something else, I simply say those two bear a slightly different comparison. I will simply say there is nothing small about 39 billion. I honestly believe one of the reasons we voted to leave was to take back control and get most of our money back from the European Union and to use it to the sort of things that my honourable friend may well be indicating. And I therefore think, as I said earlier, in principle, providing we got something really good from them, I'm not against meeting our requirements, but I am against doing it without any commitment whatsoever. And I think that's where the major and gentle criticism, I hope, of my honourable friends is. And the third point I want to say, which is really on state aid, this has not really raised its head very much, and I would think the front benches officers might want to pay a little bit of attention to this. A lot of people think that state aid is just about a few provisions to be able to stop people, giving certain of their domestic industries a head start. First of all, I've always had a concern about this in democratic terms. I know many on my side will say, oh, it's terrible, we're not in favour of giving industries and others a boost. Well, we may not be. But we do live in a democracy, and there is a reality that others may wish to pitch for a different kind of position, and I accept that fully. I really hope that the public never votes for that. I believe we have a better provision. But I do think there's a democratic problem here in being able to do this. But it's not really my main issue. My main issue is the width with which state aid is now being interpreted. And the reality is that the court, and I made a speech about this back in about 1993 or 4, I said, the Commission knows very well that no matter what it does and fails to get, the courts will mop up after it, because they are a court bound on one thing and one thing only, which is finding always in favour of ever closer union. Of course they are. That's what they were set up to do. That's exactly what's clear. Many in this House don't seem to recognise that. And that means that they always pick up the pieces. You only have to look at social security spending on people who were coming into the UK under freedom of movement. Originally, it was never in the treaty. It is the courts, through a whole number of cases, that have widened the provisions to allow those coming to claim benefits exactly in line with people who live in the country. It wasn't the Commission in that sense, and it wasn't the Council that did it, it was the Court. And this is exactly what's happening now here. Now, the Commission's had real problems with tax harmonisation. That is their objective for the Eurozone and generally for Europe, the European Union. The courts now are already entering this, using the provisions of state aid to start finding against countries that find new tax advantages for them. That is what they're doing, and that is where they intend to go. You can read some of the summaries of the judgments. You will see that they're already moving into this area. And therefore I say to some of my colleagues that they think it's all right for 2 years just to sit back passively. They have already a plan to drive that process harder. And I also hear of the 12 people responsible for monitoring the EU's provisions of state aid, 8 have now been moved to cover the UK in the period of the 2 years before we strike a trade deal. So I warn my colleagues on this side of the House, be careful what we wish for in this, because those state aid provisions will bite us in terms of tax harmonisation and some of the changes we might make to which in future budgets. And I would want now to therefore come to the conclusions of this so others can speak. I simply say that we have had a series of scare stories about a whole series of problems that will come if we don't strike arrangements. I want to have an arrangement, don't get me wrong. I absolutely want it. I think that the government is in the right place to want to get it as well. I just don't think this arrangement delivers on the minimum that we require to be able to negotiate and deliver a proper trade deal. And I say to my honourable friends, we really need to pack up the idea of this total disaster that keeps being pumped around. As my right honourable friend from the dispatch box today has made it clear before, he does not believe that this is a disaster. He believes that we will manage through it one way or the other. But the other day we were told there are huge queues going to be coming down across Dover because Calais, according to the contingency executive, will have to check every single lorry, and it will take 10 minutes. What do we hear from the man that runs Boulogne and Calais? Said we've no plans and will not check every lorry. We will do nothing more than we are doing at the moment, and any biosanitary checks will be done 12 kilometres behind the border. They do not want what we say we fear because it damages them and damages their business, and they know they will lose it. Just one example of some of the nonsense that's gone on over Project Fear in the last few years. We've constantly banged on about this, and I think far from making people worry about it, it's actually made people very, very angry about what politicians do to try and threaten and worry them. Let's treat them like grown-ups and talk about this in a proper way and debate it properly, not try and frighten them. So in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, I just want to... yes, the last time, I really am going to.
I'm just interested because he's saying that his concerns over support for this government deal, the withdrawal agreement bill, are around what position it leaves us in for future free trade agreements. But of course, without this withdrawal agreement bill, there can be no future trade agreements. So what is his position on that?
My position is that we go back and get a better one, and that's the reality, because I just believe this is how the EU works. They got everything they wanted first time round, but the reality, if they know that we're not going to take this, they have to discuss this with them. And I also know that in the Commission, when I went there to meet Monsieur Barnier and Sabine Weyand and the whole of their team, it became very clear to me that they, at the time, before we signed up to this, were fully expecting to actually take this further once pressed hard, and that is to say that this wouldn't pass. And they've been waiting for this vote to know exactly where they're going. And my view is genuinely that I think that the government will be in a better place to go and say, look, this stuff that you've given us and this stuff that we've got is simply not acceptable, and we will not get it through. And therefore, if we genuinely, as I believe they do, want to reach an agreement, then we have to strike a harder deal with them, and they have to accept that, and will do. And I believe that's really where we are. And therefore, I want to conclude by saying, you know, back in 1992, I realised that the departure under the plans from the Single European Act of Maastricht all the way through were taking us to a place that we would never be in, that this country would never accept, that it would eventually be fully locked into a supranational organisation that was taking powers away from those individual parliaments. And to that end, that's why I feel very upbeat about the idea of the vote that we took. I'm tired of being told that this was some sort of disaster or some accident. I genuinely and passionately believe when I campaign to leave that this country will do incredibly well, whatever the arrangements are. And Mr. Speaker, I just wish many more in this House would stand up for those who voted to leave genuinely, not stupidly, not because they hated people, but because they wanted something to change, they wanted to take back control of their country, and that's what I want to do.